Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you very much for tuning in. This is a screencast-o-matic presentation and recording for the part of the lesson that has us looking at the Gilded Age, the American West. Before we get started, please let me encourage you to open up to today's lesson and to scroll down the correct section and to fill in the key content that coincides with the blank spaces provided in your notes on the Google Doc. Let's go ahead and get started, and please remember that you can replay any part of this presentation for detail or clarity later. The Gilded Age, the story of the West. Consider this question: what factors led to the settlement of the West during the Gilded Age in America from 1870 to 1900? That is the essential focus of today's lesson. The Gilded Age, by historians, or at least dubbed by historians, lasted from 1870 to 1900. What does gilded mean, though? After the Civil War, the United States entered an era known as the Gilded Age, when America and Americans experienced rapid changes. In many ways, these rapid changes were fundamental to the very nature of who America is. After the Civil War, not only was the area west of the Mississippi River settled, miners, ranchers, farmers flooded into the frontier looking for economic opportunities. Transcontinental railroads connected the country. Plains Indians were forced to assimilate and move to reservations. By the year 1890, the frontier was actually closed. Understanding these fundamental changes and shifts in the story of us helps us understand more about the American changing identity and the experience that, of course, involves the mid-1800s to the early 1900s. In terms of a visual summary here, understanding the nature of the clash of cultures on the frontier can be best understood by the different demographics of peopling that comprise to form the American West, from Native Americans who of the plains had hunted, farmed, traded traditional ways, and plains peoples, of course, relied on buffalo for a variety of survival needs, to ranchers and cowhands who ushered in the era of the long drive and the roundup. The Texas Longhorn cattle took place of the buffalo as dominant animal of the Great Plains, to homesteaders, who were the hundreds of thousands of people who settled on the plains, claiming land grants from the U.S. government, to the farmers and the populist movement that took place, where new settlement with barbed wire and bad weather ended the cattle boom. Farmers across the South, Midwest, and West organized to address their common economic problems, and additionally miners. Of course, with the discovery of gold and other precious metals in the West, this led to rapid expansion and settlement west. The mining bonanza. Mining was the first magnet to attract settlers in the West. Before the Civil War, miners discovered gold in California, Colorado, and Nevada. After the Civil War, miners resumed their migration into the West to find more gold and more silver. Additionally, upon doing so, this would lead to a population boom in the West that would change the American landscape forever. The mining regions of the West can best be understood by this infographic right here. As you can see here by the key, with gold mining regions and silver mining regions, clearly there was no shortage of different types of mining reservoirs in the American West. Additionally, with $306 million in gold and silver being discovered as the Comstock Lode, and John Mackay becoming the richest man in the world, who would earn $25 a minute from his big bonanza find in the Cedar Mountains, stories of the iconic rags to riches in the American West became synonymous with American success during this time. Additionally, mining towns were formed in the West. They needed government, they needed law enforcement, and businesses. Basically, the essentials of a civilization that Americans easily had back east, but in a sense, this would be altered in the West, for many different reasons. Corporations had expensive machinery, like hydraulic mining techniques, to extract most of the gold in the West, and so over time, the traditional panning for gold method would change, and rightfully so. Chinese and Latin American immigrants came to find gold as well. But American nativism led Congress to pass the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, which ended Chinese immigration. Of course, upon doing so, this would forever change the immigration flow patterns to the United States for a substantial period of time. But let's talk about ranchers and the cattle boom. After the Civil War, the demand for beef skyrocketed. To meet this demand, ranchers drove Texas Longhorns across open range to railroad towns. Upon doing this, the cattle brought in Texas for $4 could be sold for $40 in Kansas. Cattle drives created new towns. In many ways, people associate this to be sort of the caravans of the Silk Road, if you will, but across the American West. As caravans and cattle droves were able to establish new forms of settlements, so too did they establish a sense of culture. Ranchers used the open range to graze longhorns, and during the 3-month-long drive that became iconic with the American cowboy and rancher experience, you can see here by this map the general route of transportation. Additionally, by 1867, ranchers started using trains to ship cattle to meatpacking cities like Chicago. And later on, the big business factories of industry in Chicago would become synonymous with cattle producing and meatpacking industries. By the 1880s, cattle ranching was difficult for many reasons, but mostly because the open range, or the once open range, was closed as farmers used new barbed wire fencing to close off their farms and to essentially mark their territory. But also overgrazing and drought left little grasslands for grazing cattle. And another thing that should be overlooked here is that competition from sheep herding would also encroach on the once profitable cattle drove. The U.S. government offered incentives for farmers to settle the West, and in many ways people took them up on these offers. The Homestead Act of 1862 gave 160 acres to citizens who pledged to improve the land, end quote, for at least 5 years. And other government acts helped develop Western lands by planting trees and building irrigation systems, and the physical infrastructure added to the West in a big dynamic way. Additionally, by this map you can see the different types of foliage and greenery that inhabited the West. Think about how the American movement west also impacted the physical and natural geographic landscapes. By 1900, 600,000 Americans claimed homesteads across the American West. And by those homesteaders establishing their homesteads, this would of course lead to a different type of culture clash in the West as well. Speaking of culture, life in the plains was incredibly difficult. There were few trees, so homesteaders built sod houses. It should be noted here that this was not a lucrative or wonderful lifestyle. 60% of homesteaders did fail in their endeavor. Now, additionally, many homesteaders did adapt and try their best to adjust. They used dry farming techniques, planted tough varieties of wheat, used harvesting machinery to toil and till the land. Even with the most advanced machinery for the time, people still met hardship though. This map here shows you, of course, the diverse array of the major crop exporters from different parts of the United States. And you can see here, of course, the essence of the animal populations and, of course, the industries that they coincide with, as well as the crop populations and the industries that they coincide with here by the key. Exodusters were also key to the American West. These were black farmers who moved west to escape crop lines and Jim Crow laws in the South. The mass migrations from the South would forever change the dynamic and landscape of the American West too. Even this piece of propaganda to your right exhibits the essence of racism, but also at the same time the need and the desire to go west. The allure for Exodusters was in many ways multifaceted. But in 1890, the western frontier not only closed because of barbed wire, there was also no more unorganized territories in the West to essentially gather to be part of one's domain. In 1862, Congress authorized the first transcontinental railroad, which ought also seal the fate for the American West. The Union Pacific worked westward from Nebraska with Irish laborers, and the Central Pacific worked eastward from California with Chinese immigrants. On May 10, 1869, the two tracks met at Promontory Point in Utah, and the iconic Golden Spike was essentially drilled in. Although the first transcontinental railroad connected the West Coast to the eastern cities in 1869, this also had a dramatic impact on the cultural exports of region to region, and also from the peopling exports to and interactions from region to region. Irish workers made up a large percentage of laborers on the eastern section, and Chinese workers made up a large percentage of the laborers on the western leg. And additionally, it should be noted here that the building processes for these railroads would not have been possible without the immigrant populations for their time. Even federal land grants to consummate the railroads by 1871 played a huge role too. The national government gave out $65 million and millions of acres to railroad companies to connect the east and west coast with railroads. And as you can see here by this map, you can probably visibly see the iconic importance of railroads in the American West. When the Transcontinental Railroad was finished, the United States would forever be changed, fundamentally speaking. And the Transcontinental Railroad would also spark other forms of infrastructure and building too. Probably one of the most important achievements of the railroad itself was the standardization of time from Eastern, Central, Mountain, and Pacific. The time zones that we now, of course, have today are in fact rooted in the times of the Transcontinental. Railroad construction can best be depicted too by this chart right here. As you can see, there was no better time like the mid to late 1800s to build a railroad and be part of the railroad boom. Of course, this would also come with confines and some restrictions too, and some downfalls. One of the biggest downfalls of all this infrastructure and building and settling of the West was the interaction and, of course, the consequences of interactions with the Plains Indians. In 1865, 2/3 of all Indians lived on the Great Plains. Their culture was dependent upon the buffalo and the horse, and in many ways their culture would become dramatically changed as buffalo were heavily hunted by westward people. The importance of the buffalo is renowned, but what you may not know is that Indians found a way to use all parts of the buffalo. The skull of the buffalo was considered sacred and was used in many Native American rituals. The horns were carved into bowls and spoons. The bones themselves of the buffalo were made into hide scrappers, tool handles, sled runners, and hoe blades. The hoofs were ground up and used as glue. And the hide of the animal was by far the most precious part of the buffalo, as Native American clothing, teepees, and even arrow shields were made from buffalo hide. Over time, though, of course, the buffalo population would meet its demise substantially. Americans' Indian policy, of course, didn't help matters. Americans' Indian policy did change dramatically. For example, in the 1830s, Indians were moved across the Mississippi River into one big reservation. You might, of course, remember learning about Andrew Jackson and the Trail of Tears. However, in the 1850s, mostly due to Manifest Destiny and this sweep and fervor westward, Indians were moved into concentrated reservations that were more confined. In the 1860s, reservations were violated by farmers and miners, and often there was very little enforcement of the regulatory codes for the time. This, of course, prompted many Indian wars. In 1876, Americans flooded into Sioux territory in South Dakota when gold was discovered, and of course, as predicted, U.S. Army Colonel George Custer attempted to drive the Sioux off their land with a small force of cavalrymen, but they were greatly outnumbered. So the Indians drove back Custer, a force by 3,000 warriors, led by a Sioux chief Sitting Bull, and wiped out every soldier in Custer's group. The Battle of Little Bighorn, also known as Custer's Last Stand, was the most decisive victory for the Indians against invading Americans. The demise of Custer led to the U.S. government increasing its efforts to subdue the Indians. And, of course, this would have adverse effects on the Indian populations from here on out. Indian wars would soon become iconic with the story of the American West. When the U.S. Army tried to stop the Sioux ghost dances, over 200 men, women, and children were slaughtered by Americans during the massacre at Wounded Knee. This is one of the saddest days and saddest times in Native American history, as, of course, Americans encroached on their land even farther. Even the mass grave at Wounded Knee had many bodies that were buried, often systematically. Now, the massacre at Wounded Knee in 1890 was not only the major event of the Indian Wars, it was forever ingrained in the minds of the American Indian experience for years and years to come. The end of tribal life really comes down to the final blow to Indian culture with the annihilation of the buffalo, too. It began with the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1860s, and from 1872 to 1874, 3 million buffalo were killed each year. The cession of Indian territory would forever have a profound impact, too, on Native American relations. Already devastated by centuries of European diseases, killing millions of Indians, Indian culture was then all but eradicated by American invasion. Today, the Indians are reduced to a small faction of their original population and living mainly on reservations. In conclusion here, one can see that by 1890 the frontier was closed. Miners, ranchers, and farmers flooded the West and terrible expensive Indians. But the Westerners began to grow frustrated due to their dependency on Eastern railroads, banks, and politicians. This type of frustration would lead to a huge divide. And additionally, the American West would forever be changed by the supply and demand of crops, goods, services. But now the United States has acquired and occupied all the lands between the Atlantic and the Pacific, one has to wonder what's next. Of course, for those of you guys who know your history, the expansion of the American economy and the booming of the American economy would be what's next. So we will get to more of that later on with the Gilded Age, so have no fear about that. But we will, of course, end that presentation there. Thank you so much for tuning in, and good luck with completing the rest of the lesson.